Very good. Representative Slater, can you tell us about 5555?
Thank you, Chairman and committee members. It's an honor to be here before you once again this year. I guess this is the Cannabis Day, as we will call it, in the General Assembly, so we have a lot of bills that will come before. Just before I even start with my testimony, I will say that back in 2006, the medical marijuana bill was passed. It was one of my father's legislative acts. In 2009, I want to say the Compassion Center model passed as one of his last legislative acts that he was up here. So in and of the fact, outside of me believing this is good public policy, it's something that my father was very much interested, was very devoted to and worked on, and it's something that I kind of have taken over as a representative. I will thank Representative Edith Agello, who's on the committee right now, who paved the way with early legalization legislation. I thank her for her support throughout the years as I've sponsored this legislation, her guidance, and she's always been a trailblazer on many issues. We have a few bills that are before us tonight, but I'm here to talk about 5555, and it's for legalization of marijuana. So thank you, Chairman, and the honorable members. This is not the first time I come before the honorable committee to urge passage of a law to legalize and regulate marijuana for adult use. This year, however, is different. About 14 months from now, Rhode Islanders will be able to cross the border to Massachusetts and buy marijuana in illegal retail stores. If the General Assembly does not act, we will not be reducing Rhode Island's access to marijuana. We will only be reducing our access to additional tax revenue and reducing access to good-paying jobs for our constituents. To be clear, I do not believe the legislation should only be approved based on fiscal or economic considerations, even though I do think it's appropriate at this time with Massachusetts. Primarily, this legislation deserves your support because it's a smart policy from public health and safety perspective, and because it has the backing of nearly 60% of our constituents across the state. You will hear tonight from many advocates, including faith leaders, public health professionals, social justice advocates, and others who will make the case that regulating marijuana is the right policy for many reasons. Doing nothing on this bill and holding it for further study until the session ends is not taking a neutral stance. It is an active decision to maintain the current policy, a policy which most voters believe does more harm than good. The choice before you is prohibition or regulation. Forget the mechanics of the bill right now. The choice is prohibition or regulation. So there really is no middle ground. Taking no action is an endorsement of a failed status quo that is actually actively causing harm to our state. My partner on this issue is Senator Josh Miller in the Senate. And when drafting this legislation, we knew we needed to present responsible and thoughtful bill. And I believe that that is what's before us. That said, we hope the committee and other colleagues in the building will assess the legislation to help us facilitate a constructive conversation about possible amendments. Now, as I've always said coming before this committee, I'm always open to input, to constructive criticism. What I will say is, and the good news to Representative Agello, who started this before me, is when you know you're making progress in this building when you start hearing study. That's the way of delaying. And once you start hearing study and take more time, it's the way we know we're making progress and that folks are moving that way. So, unfortunately, some vocal opponents to this legislation have mischaracterized what the bill actually says. So I would like to take a few minutes to explain a few of the key components of this legislation, some changes to previous legislation. First, this legislation would establish a phased-in approach. We will not see hundreds of marijuana businesses open up overnight in our state. There is a timeline in place that initially allows existing medical marijuana compassion centers to begin sales. After that, other applicants will be permitted to obtain registrations with an initial benchmark after 1 year. 2 years after passage, the bill would allow for more to be added. If the timeline for this needs to be changed, or if benchmarks or recommendations need to be made, we are open to having conversation on that. But overall, I support a phased-in, slow approach to give us plenty of time to get the regulations right. Second, this bill would ensure that regulations are implemented with transparency and accountability. A cannabis advisory board, whose expert members would be appointed by the legislature and executive branch, would monitor the program, hold public discussions, and make recommendations for changes as the process unfolds. The body would be composed of legislators, public health professionals, law enforcement, attorneys, and stakeholders who have an interest of proactively addressing potential issues within the implementation of this law. Third, the legislation gives, and this is very important, local cities and towns significant control over marijuana businesses. Local governments have the authority under this bill to establish additional regulations or ordinances, such as zoning ordinances, to further control how, when, and where marijuana businesses operate in their jurisdictions. Residents of towns can also choose to ban marijuana businesses altogether in a referendum scheduled during a normal election. Fourth, this bill will contain strict rules on edible marijuana and an 18-month delay on those products. All edible marijuana products would be required to pass a mandatory approval process before being allowed for sale. And the legislation specifically prohibits products that are designed to appealing to children, such as a marijuana-infused candy. Additionally, all marijuana products must be sold in opaque, child-proof packaging. Fifth, the bill includes strong restrictions on advertising. TV, radio, billboard, magazines, newspaper ads, and so on would not be allowed. The legislation would make Rhode Island one of the states with the strictest rules on marijuana advertising. Sixth, the legislation would direct tax revenue into a restricted receipt account to fund programs combating opioid misuse. After covering the cost of enforcement and implementation, 35% of the tax revenue raised from marijuana would go to BHDDH for the purpose of funding programs to help us address the opioid crisis, including treatment, recovery, and prevention services. These programs are currently underfunded at a time when they are particularly crucial. Seventh, the bill would allow retroactive expungement of low-level marijuana offenses. Thousands of the fellow Rhode Islanders are held back by minor marijuana offenses in their past. Our legislation would make it possible for these individuals to have their records expunged, which would make it easier for them to get a job and access to other social needs. Again, I want to reiterate, we are eager to have a conversation in the coming weeks about how to make improvements in this legislation. I believe it would be senseless to delay passage of this bill this year, when Rhode Islanders will soon have access to legal marijuana anyway in Massachusetts. If we end the session with no legalization legislation passed, we will not be restricting Rhode Island access to legal marijuana. Let's understand that. I mean, anywhere you go in the state of Rhode Island, Massachusetts is not far. So all this bill would do is prevent the economy from expanding and deny state tax revenue that we need to address budget issues. I respectfully urge to hold a vote and to pass this important legislation. Thank you.
Thank you, Representative Slater. Any questions for the sponsor?